What if peace between Jews and Arabs wasn't just a distant hope or a romantic illusion? What if, even before the creation of the State of Israel, there was already a real, concrete, and surprising proposal for coexistence between two peoples who today seem irreconcilable? In the middle of the 20th century, while the world was divided by wars, occupations, and nationalist ideologies, one man dared to dream differently. He was neither a politician nor a general. He was a thinker, a philosopher, a Jew who believed that the true path to building a nation did not pass through weapons, but through dialogue. His name was Martin Buber. This man was Martin Buber, and today, when we watch the news about the conflict in the Middle East, when we see headlines about Gaza, the West Bank, rockets and retaliations, almost no one remembers his dream. But maybe that is exactly why we need to talk about him. The question that would change Martin Buber's life began to form one afternoon in 1892, when he was only 14 years old. He was in a synagogue in Vienna, listening to the prayers in Hebrew that everyone recited mechanically, when something inside him rebelled. "Why am I here?" he thought. "What does this really mean to me?" This was not a common question for a Jewish teenager in late 19th century Vienna. Most simply followed family traditions without questioning. But Martin Buber was never like most. Born on February 8, 1878, into a middle-class Jewish family, Buber grew up in a time of profound transformations. Europe was bubbling with new ideas. Socialism was gaining strength. Nationalism was awakening entire peoples. Science was challenging old religious certainties. And for Jews especially, the times were both hopeful and terrifying. In Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Jews lived a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, they had won civil rights, could attend universities, and participate in cultural and economic life. On the other hand, anti-Semitism grew like a sinister shadow. Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, won elections with hateful speeches that would echo decades later in Hitler's voice. It was in this tense environment that Martin grew up, dividing his time between his parents' home in Vienna and his paternal grandparents' rural estate in Galicia. This division was crucial in shaping his personality. At his grandparents' house, especially with his grandfather Salomon Buber, Martin had deep contact with Jewish tradition. Salomon was a respected scholar, knowledgeable in the Talmud and sacred texts, but he was not a blind traditionalist. He taught his grandson that Judaism was a living tradition, one that needed to be constantly reinterpreted and renewed. "Tradition is not a museum," his grandfather said. "It is a flowing river. If it stops flowing, it becomes a swamp." These words were etched in young Martin's mind. He learned to see Judaism not as a rigid set of rules, but as a constant search for meaning, a conversation between generations that needed to continue, evolve, and adapt to new times. But it was in cosmopolitan Vienna that Martin discovered the other side of the equation, the non-Jewish world. He attended a German gymnasium where he was one of the few Jewish students. He read Goethe, Schiller, Nietzsche. He discovered German philosophy, which fascinated him with its great questions about human existence. And it was there that he felt, for the first time, the weight of anti-Semitism. Classmates who avoided him after discovering he was Jewish. Teachers who made veiled comments. The constant feeling of having to prove he deserved to be there. At 18, when he enrolled at the University of Vienna to study philosophy, Martin Buber was already a young man divided between worlds. Jewish but questioning traditions. German in culture but a foreigner in acceptance. A philosopher by vocation, but seeking practical answers to very real problems. It was at university that he encountered the nascent Zionist movement. Theodor Herzl, who also lived in Vienna, had just written The Jewish State, proposing a radical solution to the Jewish question, a homeland where Jews would no longer have to live as a persecuted minority. The idea electrified young Martin. Finally, a concrete answer to the dilemma that had troubled him since he was 14. But even so, something did not fit perfectly. Herzl's proposal was essentially political, to create a state like any other, with borders, an army, and a government. But what about the spiritual dimension? And the cultural renewal his grandfather spoke so much about? That's when Martin discovered Hasidism. In 1897, at 19 years old, he made a trip to Galicia that would change his life. He visited Hasidic communities, groups of devout Jews who lived in intense and joyful spirituality, very different from the formal Judaism of Viennese synagogues. He saw men dancing in religious ecstasy, heard stories of wise rabbis who found God in the simplest daily tasks. Here, thought Martin, is the true Judaism, not in rules, but in experience, not in dead tradition, but in life lived with intensity. But even fascinated by Hasidism, Martin kept his critical spirit. He saw that those communities, as authentic as they were isolated from the modern world. They lived as if the 19th century did not exist, as if the discoveries of science, advances in philosophy, and social transformations were irrelevant. And that's when his great insight was born. It was necessary to build bridges between tradition and modernity, between Judaism and the modern world, between Jewish particularism and human universalism. At 22, having graduated in philosophy, Martin Buber already had the elements that would define his entire later work: the search for spiritual authenticity, respect for tradition combined with openness to the new, and especially the conviction that no truth could be found in isolation. He was ready to develop a philosophy that would revolutionize not only Jewish thought, but the very way we understand human relationships. A philosophy that began with a simple question: when I look at another person, what do I really see? Because, while the world divides between supporting Israel or Palestine, between choosing sides in a war that seems eternal, Martin Buber offered a third way, an alternative that challenged the very logic of conflict. Imagine for a moment. What if, instead of two peoples fighting for one land, we had two peoples building one land? What if, instead of walls, we had bridges? What if, instead of us versus them, we simply had us? This was not the fantasy of a dreamer detached from reality. It was the concrete proposal of a man who lived at the epicenter of the conflict, who arrived in Palestine in 1938, who saw with his own eyes the birth of Israel, who debated face-to-face with Ben-Gurion and other founders of the Israeli state. Martin Buber was not just an abstract philosopher. He was a practical visionary who believed in one revolutionary thing: that Jews and Arabs could see each other not as enemies, but as partners in building something greater. But why did this vision fail? Why was it forgotten? And more importantly, does it still make sense today, decades later, when the conflict seems more intractable than ever? The story of Martin Buber is also the story of an untrodden path, of a possibility left behind. It is the story of a man who dared to dream differently at a time when dreaming differently was almost an act of betrayal. And to understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to meet the boy who grew up in Vienna, in a Europe, on the brink of explosion, who from an early age learned to ask the question that would change his life: how should we relate to one another? The answer to that fundamental question came to Martin Buber on a spring morning in 1904, when he was 26 years old. He was walking through the streets of Berlin, observing people rushing by in their daily routines, when something extraordinary happened. He stopped seeing people and began to see unique individuals, each carrying an inner universe as complex as his own. It was at that moment that the distinction that would revolutionize modern philosophy was born. I, thou versus I, it. Buber realized that we relate to the world in two fundamentally different ways. Most of the time, we treat everything and everyone as objects, as it. The person at the supermarket cashier is a function, not a person. The coworker is a means to achieve something, not an end in themselves. Even in intimate relationships, we often reduce the other to categories. My wife, my son, my friend, as if these labels captured the totality of who they are. But sometimes, only sometimes, something magical happens. We look at someone and truly see a person, not a label, not a function, not a means to our ends, but a thou, another center of consciousness, another source of experience, another universe of possibilities. When I say thou, Buber wrote years later, I am not talking about someone, I am addressing someone. The thou is not an object of experience, but a partner in experience. The difference may seem subtle, but the consequences are revolutionary. When I see the other as it, I can study, analyze, categorize, manipulate them. When I meet the other as thou, I can only relate, dialogue, be transformed by the encounter. Buber did not arrive at this discovery in a vacuum. He had deeply studied German philosophy, especially Kant and Nietzsche. From Kant, he learned that we should never treat people merely as means, but always also as ends in themselves. From Nietzsche, he absorbed the critique of absolute truths and the emphasis on lived experience. But it was Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, who influenced his vision the most. Kierkegaard spoke about the difference between objective knowledge and subjective truth, between knowing about God and finding God. Buber took this intuition further. The difference was not only about religion, but about all human relationships. However, Buber's originality lay in transforming this philosophical insight into a practical psychology of everyday life. He showed that the I-thou versus I-it distinction was not just an abstract theory, but a choice we make at every moment of our existence. A simple example. You are in a heated argument with someone. If you treat the person as it, you are focused on winning the argument, proving you are right, categorizing the other as ignorant or stubborn. But if you manage to see the person as thou, something different happens. You become genuinely curious about why they think differently. You want to understand, not just refute. True dialogue, Buber said, does not happen when each person is trying to prove their point. It happens when each person is genuinely interested in what the other has to say. This philosophy also applied to religious experience. Buber criticized both dogmatic atheism and institutional religion because both treated God as it, either categorically denying him or defining him theologically. For him, God could only be found in the I-thou relationship, in the moment of genuine encounter, whether with another person, with nature, or directly with the sacred. He liked to tell the story of a young man who asked him, "How can I know if God exists?" Buber replied, "That is the wrong question. The right question is, how can I live so that I am open to the encounter with the divine?" The answer was not in logical proofs or religious dogmas, but in the quality of our relationships. Every time we see the other as thou, we touch something sacred. When Buber published I and Thou in 1923, the book caused an earthquake in the philosophical world. It was not just another academic treatise. It was a manifesto on how to live. Philosophers, psychologists, theologians, and educators immediately recognized that they were facing something new. But there was also resistance. Some critics argued that Buber's philosophy was beautiful in theory, but impossible in practice. How to live constantly in I-thou relationships, how to function in a modern society without sometimes treating people instrumentally. Buber admitted, the criticism. "We cannot live only in I-thou relations," he wrote. "The I-it world is necessary for practical life, but when this world becomes absolute, when we completely forget the possibility of the thou, we become less human." The goal was not to eliminate I-it relations, but to keep them in perspective. It was to recognize that behind every function, every category, every label, there is always a thou waiting to be discovered. A doctor needs to see the patient as a set of symptoms, I-it, to make a diagnosis. But if he can also see the person as thou, the whole healing process is transformed. The patient ceases to be a case and becomes a human being with fears, hopes, and a unique story. It was this practical philosophy of relationship that Buber was developing when historical events began to demand more urgent applications. Anti-Semitism was rising in Europe, the Zionist movement was gaining strength, and Martin Buber found himself facing an inevitable question: how to apply the I-thou philosophy to the conflict between peoples. The answer to this question would not be merely theoretical. It would require Buber to leave the security of European academic life and move to the epicenter of the conflict that would define the 20th century in the Middle East. It was time to discover if his philosophy of dialogue could survive the test of the most brutal political reality. The first time Martin Buber heard about Theodor Herzl was during a heated conversation at Vienna's Café Central in 1896. A group of Jewish students passionately debated whether the solution to anti-Semitism was total assimilation or emigration to some distant territory. Buber, then 18 years old, listened silently, but his ideas were already stirring in a completely different direction. When Herzl published The Jewish State the following year, Buber was among the first to read it. The proposal was seductive in its simplicity. Jews needed a national state like any other people, a defined territory, their own government, modern institutions. Anti-Semitism would automatically end when Jews were no longer a vulnerable minority, but a sovereign majority in their own land. Buber joined the Zionist movement, but from the start with reservations. He participated in the Third Zionist Congress in 1899 in Basel, where he met Herzl in person. The meeting was revealing. Herzl was a brilliant political visionary but seemed to treat the Jewish question as a purely technical problem. Acquire territory, organize immigration, build a state. The spiritual and cultural dimension of Judaism was, for him, a secondary detail. Herzl wants to create a state that happens to be Jewish, thought Buber. But I want to renew Judaism that, perhaps, creates a state. This difference in perspective soon turned into open conflict. In 1901, Buber became editor of the Zionist periodical Die Welt, but his editorial positions constantly irritated the movement's leadership. While Herzl focused on international diplomacy and practical colonization, Buber wrote about spiritual, renewal, and intercultural dialogue. The tension exploded at the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1901. Buber proposed a motion suggesting the movement invest as much in Jewish education as in colonization. What good, he asked from the podium, is conquering a land if we lose our soul in the process? The audience was divided. Many delegates applauded, but Herzl was visibly irritated. After the Congress, he called Buber for a private talk. "Martin," he said, "you are young and idealistic, but the real world demands practical choices. We can philosophize about culture after we have a country." Buber fundamentally disagreed. For him, the after would never come if the before was built on the wrong foundations. A Jewish state that ignored Jewish values would be just another European nationalist state, replicating the very problems that had created anti-Semitism in the first place. It was then that Buber articulated his alternative, cultural Zionism. Instead of focusing exclusively on creating a political state, the movement should prioritize renewing Jewish culture. This included reviving Hebrew as a living language, developing modern Jewish art and literature, and especially rediscovering the ethical values that made Judaism a unique contribution to humanity. "We do not want to be like all nations," Buber wrote in 1902. "We want to be a nation that offers something special to the world, and that something special will not come from our military strength or economy, but from our ability to live by the values our prophets proclaimed millennia ago." This vision placed Buber in a complicated position within the Zionist movement. He was not an anti-Zionist. He genuinely believed Jews needed some form of national center. But he was also not a conventional Zionist because he questioned whether the European nation-state model was suitable for the Jewish project. The issue became even more complex when Buber began studying the situation in Palestine. Unlike many European Zionists, who saw the region as a land without a people for a people without a land, Buber recognized early on that an Arab population had been established there for centuries. In 1903, he wrote a provocative article titled, "The Other People." He argued that any Jewish project in Palestine would need to consider the rights and interests of the local Arab population. "We cannot build our freedom on the oppression of others," he wrote. "That would be a betrayal of our own values." The reaction was immediate and hostile. Herzl called him naive. Other Zionist leaders accused him of weakening the movement with unnecessary scruples. But Buber held his ground. For him, the issue was not political tactics, but ethical coherence. He began developing the idea that Zionism should be a movement of renewal, not just restoration. Instead of trying to recreate the ancient kingdom of Israel, Jews should build something new, a society combining Jewish tradition with modern values, including social justice and respect for human rights. This vision led Buber to become interested in socialism, but again in an unconventional way. He did not embrace orthodox Marxism with its emphasis on class struggle and revolution. Instead, he developed a form of humanist socialism based on voluntary cooperation and communal life. In 1909, Buber visited Palestine for the first time. The experience was transformative. He saw the first kibbutzim, agricultural communities where European Jews tried to create a new way of life based on equality and cooperative work. He was fascinated but also concerned. On one hand, he saw in the kibbutzim the practical realization of many of his ideas about social renewal. On the other, he noticed these communities lived in almost total isolation from the local Arab population. There was little dialogue, little cultural exchange, little attempt to build a truly shared society. "We are creating Jewish islands in an Arab sea," he wrote in his diary. "This may work in the short term, but it is not sustainable. Sooner or later we will have to decide, do we want to live with our neighbors or against them?" This question would become central to Buber's entire later work. And when World War I began reshaping the Middle East, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and European powers started redrawing borders, Buber realized the time for theoretical choices was ending. It was time to turn philosophy into politics, theory into practice. And to do that, he would have to leave Europe and move to Palestine, where he could apply his philosophy of dialogue in the most difficult possible context, an ethnic and religious conflict just beginning to reveal its true intensity. When Martin Buber set foot for the first time in the port of Haifa, in March 1938 at 60 years old, Palestine was a powder keg about to explode. The British Mandate, established after World War I, was trying to balance contradictory promises made to both Jews and Arabs. The 1917 Balfour Declaration had promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, but without prejudicing the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. In practice, this diplomatic formula was proving impossible to implement. Buber arrived at a particularly tense moment. The Great Arab Revolt, which had started in 1936, was still shaking the country. Attacks on Jewish settlements alternated with British repression of Arab villages. The air was thick with mutual distrust, fear, and resentment. For many, it seemed the worst possible time to arrive with theories about dialogue and cooperation. But for Buber, it was exactly the right time. It
is easy to talk about peace when there is no conflict, he wrote to a friend in Berlin.
The true test of our ideas comes when they are most needed and seemingly most impossible. The move to Palestine had not been an easy decision. Buber had an established academic career in Germany, was a respected intellectual, and lived comfortably in Frankfurt. But the rise of Nazism made that life unsustainable. In 1933, he was banned from teaching at German universities. His books were burned in public squares. Former colleagues avoided him in the streets. Ironically, it was Nazi persecution that finally forced Buber to do what he had been postponing for decades: put his theories about cultural Zionism to the test of reality. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem welcomed him as a professor of sociology. It was a prestigious position, but also an immense challenge. The university, founded in 1925, was a symbol of the Zionist project to create modern institutions on Palestinian soil, but it was also at the center of the region's political tensions. Buber settled in a modest house in the Talbia neighborhood of Jerusalem. The neighborhood was mixed. Newly arrived European Jews lived alongside Arab families established for generations. For many residents, it was just a geographic coincidence. For Buber, it was an opportunity. He began to learn Arabic systematically, not just basic words to communicate at the market, but literary Arabic to be able to read Arabic poetry and philosophy. He established relationships with Arab intellectuals in Jerusalem, participated in discussions about literature and religion, and visited families in their homes. "How can I talk about dialogue," he said, "if I cannot converse with my neighbors in their own language?" This practical approach to the I-thou philosophy impressed many, but also drew criticism. Some university colleagues considered his initiatives naive or even dangerous. Martin, the dean once told him, "You cannot simply ignore that we are in conflict. There are security issues." Buber did not ignore the reality of the conflict. On the contrary, he studied it obsessively. He read newspapers in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. He talked to British soldiers, Jewish community leaders, Arab intellectuals. He visited attacked kibbutzim and Arab villages under curfew. What impressed him most was how fear was transforming both sides. Jews who had come to Palestine as idealists, dreaming of a just society, were gradually becoming more defensive, more suspicious. Arabs who had initially viewed Jewish immigration with curiosity or indifference now saw it as an existential threat. "Fear is the greatest enemy of dialogue," he wrote in his diary. "When people are afraid, they stop seeing the other as thou and start seeing them only as a potential threat." It was in this context that Buber began organizing his first concrete dialogue initiatives. In 1939, he created a discussion group bringing together Jewish and Arab professors from the Hebrew University and other Jerusalem institutions. Meetings were held bi-weekly in a neutral room and followed strict rules. No political propaganda, focus on cultural and philosophical issues, absolute respect for differing opinions. At first, few believed the group would survive. The first meetings were tense, full of misunderstandings and suspicions. But gradually something interesting began to happen. Participants stopped seeing each other as representatives of their ethnic groups and began to know each other as individuals. Ahmad, an Arab literature professor, discovered he shared a passion for medieval poetry with David, a Jewish historian. Miriam, a Jewish sociologist, and Fatima, an Arab educator, realized they faced similar challenges as professional women in a traditional society. "Do you see?" Buber commented after one meeting. "When we stop defining ourselves only by our differences, we discover our similarities." But the group also faced increasing external pressure. Leaders from both communities criticized participants for fraternizing with the enemy. Some members were threatened by extremists. Others simply gave up, tired of social pressure. World War II, which began just months after Buber's arrival in Palestine, intensified all these tensions. News of the Holocaust arrived fragmented but terrible. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees sought entry into Palestine, further straining the region's capacity. For Buber, each piece of news from Europe was a painful reminder of why he had left everything behind. Friends and family were being deported, tortured, murdered. The urgency to create a safe refuge for Jews became clearer each day. Yet even in the face of this tragedy, Buber refused to abandon his vision of coexistence. "Precisely because we suffer so much," he said, "we cannot allow our suffering to make us insensitive to the suffering of others." It was an increasingly difficult position to maintain. And when the war ended, when the full extent of the Holocaust became known, when pressure for a definitive solution to the Palestinian question intensified, Buber realized it was time to transform his theories into concrete political proposals. The philosopher would have to become an activist. The dialogue theorist would have to face the most brutal political arena of his time, and the question that haunted him was, would it be possible to apply the I-thou philosophy in a situation where people were literally killing each other because of their differences? In September 1942, in a small room at the Hebrew University, Martin Buber gathered a group of Jewish intellectuals to discuss an idea that many considered impossible, others deemed treacherous, and a few regarded as the only real hope for peace in the Middle East: the creation of a binational state in Palestine. The idea was not entirely new. Since the 1920s, some Jewish and Arab thinkers had entertained the possibility of some form of shared political arrangement. But it was Buber who gave systematic shape to the proposal, transforming a vague aspiration into a detailed political project. The group that met that afternoon included some of the brightest minds in the Jewish world. There was Judah Magnus, rector of the Hebrew University, and, like Buber, an American who had become cosmopolitan. Ernst Simon, an educator who shared the vision of cultural Zionism. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, and several other intellectuals, all united by one conviction. Traditional political Zionism was leading Jews and Arabs toward a catastrophic collision. "Gentlemen," Buber said as he opened that first meeting, "we are here because we believe there is an alternative to permanent war. But to find it, we need the courage to question premises that our own comrades consider sacred." The fundamental premise Buber questioned was the necessity of an exclusively Jewish state. For most Zionists, this was unquestionable. After centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust then unfolding in Europe, Jews needed complete sovereignty over their own destiny. But Buber saw things differently. Sovereignty over what, he asked? Over a land inhabited by another people? Over a region where we will forever be a precarious majority, dependent on military force to maintain our position? That is not security. It is a recipe for permanent conflict. The alternative he proposed was radical in its simplicity. Instead of two separate states or one state dominated by one group, why not create a truly shared state? The model Buber had in mind was not unique in the world. Switzerland, with its different linguistic and religious groups, demonstrated that it was possible to build a stable democracy based on diversity. Czechoslovakia, before being destroyed by the Nazis, had functioned as a multinational state. Even the United States was in essence an experiment of unity and diversity. But Buber knew Palestine presented unique challenges. The differences were not only linguistic or cultural, but also religious and increasingly nationalist. Jews and Palestinian Arabs were developing separate and, in many cases, antagonistic national identities. That is why Buber's proposal was so detailed and careful. It was not a naive merger but a sophisticated federalism that recognized and respected differences while creating structures for cooperation. The binational state would have two official languages, Hebrew and Arabic. The parliament would be composed of equal representation. Even if one group was numerically larger, both would have the same number of representatives. The government would always be a coalition, requiring cooperation between Jewish and Arab leaders for any major decision. There would be cultural autonomy for both groups. Jews would have their own educational systems, religious courts, cultural institutions, the same for the Arabs. But issues of common interest, economy, defense, foreign relations, would be decided jointly. Imagine, Buber told the skeptics, a situation where a Jewish prime minister must constantly work with an Arab deputy prime minister, where Jewish and Arab ministers sit at the same cabinet table, where Jewish and Arab soldiers serve in the same national army. Is it possible that these people would kill each other? The land issue, already becoming central to the conflict, would be resolved through agrarian reforms benefiting both groups. Large estates would be redistributed, creating small family farms and mixed agricultural cooperatives. Irrigation and water resource development would be shared projects benefiting the entire region. Economically, Buber envisioned something like the kibbutzim, but on a national scale and including Arabs, industrial cooperatives, community banks, development projects employing both Jews and Arabs. Economic cooperation, he argued, creates shared interests, and shared interests are the strongest foundation for peace. To formalize these ideas, Buber and his colleagues founded in December 1942 the organization Brit Shalom, Alliance of Peace. The name was symbolic. Brit means both covenant and circumcision in Hebrew, suggesting a commitment as deep as it is irreversible. Brit Shalom began modestly with a few dozen members, but its ideas soon gained international attention. Buber traveled to London and Washington, met with British and American diplomats, presented the proposal at European and American universities. The international reaction was mixed but generally positive. Diplomats, tired of dealing with the Palestinian problem, saw Buber's proposal as a possible way out of an apparently insoluble deadlock. Progressive intellectuals worldwide praised the humanistic vision and the courage to think beyond traditional nationalisms. But where the proposal truly needed support, among Jews and Arabs of Palestine itself, the reception was much colder. Mainstream Zionists, led by David Ben-Gurion, rejected the idea almost immediately. Buber lives in a fantasy world, Ben-Gurion declared at a Zionist executive meeting. After what happened in Europe, how can we entrust our fate to arrangements dependent on Arab goodwill? The critique hit a sensitive point. As news of the Holocaust became more detailed and horrific, the idea of sharing power with any non-Jewish group seemed to many like collective suicide. On the Arab side, the reaction was equally negative, though for different reasons. Arab leaders saw the proposal as a sophisticated way to legitimize Jewish colonization. Why, asked the Mufti of Jerusalem, should we accept dividing our land with European settlers, no matter how educated or well-intentioned they are? There was also the demographic issue. In 1942, Arabs still constituted about 2/3 of Palestine's population. Accepting equal representation would mean giving up their natural majority in favor of an artificial arrangement, benefiting the Jewish minority. Buber acknowledged these objections, but argued they were based on a short-term view. Yes, he admitted, our plan may seem disadvantageous to both sides at present, but consider the alternative: decades of war, mutual suffering, waste of resources that could be used to build a prosperous society. To demonstrate the practical viability of his ideas, Buber began organizing pilot projects. He created mixed schools where Jewish and Arab children studied together. He established agricultural cooperatives including members of both groups. He organized academic conferences where Jewish and Arab intellectuals collaborated on research. These projects were limited in scale but successful. Children in mixed schools became fluent in both languages and developed friendships crossing ethnic lines. Agricultural cooperatives were more productive than individual farms. Academic conferences produced higher quality research. Do you see? Buber told skeptics. When people work together on concrete goals, ethnic differences become secondary. The problem is not that Jews and Arabs are incompatible. It is that they never had enough opportunities to discover their compatibility. But as the 1940s progressed, time for experiments was running out. International pressure to resolve the Palestinian question increased. Britain, exhausted by war and unable to control the situation, announced its intention to hand the problem over to the United Nations. The moment had come when Buber's ideas would be tested, not in pilot projects, but in the most brutal political arena of all: the struggle for real power in a land claimed exclusively by two peoples. And so we conclude our journey through the thought of Martin Buber, a philosopher who believed in the transformative power of human encounter and in the dream of true peace between Jews and Arabs, a dream that remains more relevant than ever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like to support our channel and help spread this message. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the upcoming content where we will continue exploring ideas that make a difference in the world. And of course, share this video with friends and family who also believe that dialogue and understanding are the path to a better future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.